and welcome. My name is David Troy, and I am the co-curator and host of TEDxMidAtlantic in Washington, D.C. For those of you who are not familiar with TED or TEDx, welcome. TEDxMidAtlantic is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that produces educational events under license from TED conferences based in New York. We are one of many local TEDx event communities that you've probably seen either in person or online. And we're one of the oldest, largest, and few regional TEDx communities around. And we've been producing events and conferences since 2009. Just one second here. Okay, so as much of that kind of activity, live conferences has been disrupted during the pandemic, we've been hosting periodic virtual events that we think speak to particularly relevant topics. So it should not be surprising that we've been following the illegal war in Ukraine waged by Russia quite closely, as it represents a much broader conflict between autocracy and democracy, and it threatens to pull much of our world into conflict as well. So it's with this in mind that we've invited our two speakers and panelists here today, each with their own specialty, insights, and points of view, and we've asked each of them to prepare a short TED Talk that outlines what they think is most important to understand about the present moment, the risks posed by nuclear proliferation, and how we might make a more peaceful world for future generations. So our first speaker is Dr. Emma Belcher, who actually spoke first at TEDxMidAtlantic back in 2019 during the before times when we could do live in-person events on our stage in Washington, D.C. Her TED Talk about nuclear weapons, titled 3 Questions We Should Ask About Nuclear Weapons, has been viewed more than 2 million times. Emma is the president of Plowshares Fund. Prior to arriving at Plowshares, she spent nearly a decade at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, where she led the foundation's Nuclear Challenges grant-making program. So please welcome Dr. Emma Belcher.
Thanks very much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you.
So here we go again. Really, the last time I was invited to speak to a TED audience, the nuclear threat had reared its ugly head. There were words of fire and fury like the world has never seen. And this got friends calling me and asking, am I safe from North Korea's ballistic missile threat? This time, it's talk of consequences you've never faced in your history that have my friends calling. Words issued from a different nuclear-armed leader, yet doesn't it all sound all too familiar? The difference this time is that nuclear weapons are not merely being brandished in a joust, a verbal joust between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, but they're being used by Vladimir Putin as a tool to try to blackmail the world. Nuclear weapons have emboldened his aggression and enabled war crimes. Not since the end of the Cold War have nuclear weapons and the threat been brandished so brashly. And this time, 3 things have stood out to me. The public's reluctant awakening to a threat that's long been there, the difference between theory and reality, and the uncertain nuclear future that all of us face. So when it comes to this public awakening, the war in Ukraine has sparked renewed attention to nuclear weapons. And for some, the fear is new. Duck and cover drills were something they heard about from their grandparents. But suddenly, nuclear weapons have shifted from an abstraction to a dangerous reality in the public consciousness. Polling shows that half of Americans are very concerned that Putin would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and nearly half of Americans are just as concerned that Russia would target the US with nuclear weapons. Nearly 70% of Americans surveyed by the American Psychological Association said they are worried that the invasion of Ukraine is going to lead to nuclear war, and that they fear we're at the beginnings of World War III. Well, when the Cold War ended, we were lulled into a false sense of security and complacency as we allowed ourselves to focus less on nuclear weapons. This is understandable given the many issues that threaten communities today, and these kind of threats are more acute and regular than the threat of nuclear weapons. But the nuclear threat never fully went away. And in fact, it's grown in recent years. And now the complacency of the past few decades is coming back to haunt us. In many ways, this is our current day Cuban Missile Crisis. People were shocked and scared by Vladimir Putin's thinly veiled threat of nuclear use over Ukraine, as he reminded the world of Russia's nuclear arsenal. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in an interview on CNN that Russia's nuclear policy is to use nuclear weapons when faced with an existential threat. This is nothing new. In fact, the US has the very same policy. But when Putin claimed that the harsh sanctions the US and its allies have imposed on Russia since early March, when he referred to them as like a declaration of war, shivers went down my spine. Could Putin really try to justify a nuclear strike in response to a financial punishment for a war that he himself started? This begs the question, what counts as an existential threat to a country, and who gets to make that call? This is a question we should be asking of each nuclear power, including the United States. And in all of this, we're reminded that our fate is left in the hands of a powerful few, including those whose judgment has proven questionable in the past and suggests a recklessness in the future. When it comes to the gap between theory and reality, when I first learned about nuclear weapons back in Australia in high school, all those years ago, I was mortified, yet fascinated at the same time. Mortified that we had enough destructive power to destroy civilization as we know it many times over. Yet I was fascinated at the macabre logic of mutually assured destruction. It's a logic that purports to keep the peace. And it says if one side attacks the other can respond in kind, causing mass destruction for both sides, thus deterring either side from using weapons first. It's kind of sick and twisted when you think about it, but it makes sense. Until, that is, reality gets in the way. Russia's war in Ukraine completely discredits the claim that nuclear weapons keep the peace. Instead, Russia's nuclear arsenal is enabling Putin's aggression and war crimes, and he is threatening nuclear war in order to shape the US and NATO response. Hardly keeping the peace. Now, the US response is puzzling to many people. Why, they ask, can't the US and NATO send troops to help Ukraine? Why are they only helping to arm them? And why can't the US and NATO enforce a no-fly zone, as President Zelensky is so strongly requesting? Well, the answer is that the US is trying to do everything it can to avoid a direct confrontation between NATO and Russian forces. Because engagement between military forces of major nuclear powers could escalate to nuclear use, potentially nuclear war. Setting up and enforcing a no-fly zone means actively taking out Russian air defense systems and potentially shooting down Russian planes that enter the no-fly zone. This is a surefire recipe for escalation. Now, Putin is banking on this response. The question is, for us, what happens after Ukraine? Will the international community hold Putin to account, not only for the egregious war crimes, but also for threatening to annihilate civilians indiscriminately? Or will his lesson be that nuclear threats win the day? And in the big picture, now that Putin's gone there with the nuclear threat, how does the world live with Putin in the future? So thinking about this uncertain future and stepping back from the Ukraine crisis, it's clear that Ukraine is a symptom of a much larger problem when it comes to nuclear weapons. We rely on outdated assumptions to guarantee our security. We assume perfect information that will allow us to decipher an opponent's moves with certainty. We assume we understand the other nations and the other leaders' rationality, and that we'll never make a mistake. And we assume that the theory of mutually assured destruction, developed in the 50s, is the best we can do in these times. Does this all truly make us safer? It hasn't seemed to for the people of Ukraine. We leave all of these assumptions unchecked at our peril. I worry about the next crisis after Ukraine because there will be more. It's time to stop thinking about nuclear risk only in the immediate term and be planning for the longer term, to challenge assumptions that don't seem to work. We need to think about what behavior we're willing to accept and what role nuclear weapons play in this. The outrage that so many of you have expressed is an indicator that you're not satisfied with the status quo either. We need to take control over the future and fundamentally change the dynamics at play. So to do that, we need to include people who are normally kept out of discourse and debate and decision-making. For far too long, this topic has been relegated to a select few and wrongfully deemed too complex for wider input. But we're no better off now than we were in the 1950s, and it's all of our futures at stake. And there are ripple effects that we're seeing with this crisis. Second order effects from a conflict of this nature, such as humanitarian impacts, refugees, food shortages, famine, war crimes. So we need to look at this issue holistically. We need systemic thinking about the way nuclear weapons interact with other global problems. We need to harness the brain power and know-how of the modern age. We need to involve people in this conversation from a range of disciplines, like social psychology, behavioral economics, neuroscience, art, and technology. We need involvement of people with a range of lived experiences, including those most impacted by nuclear weapons use and development. And importantly, we need an educated public that understands the stakes, that understands posture, and that understands the destructive power of all nuclear weapons, even so-called small ones. And we need a public that understands that the endless race to develop ever more lethal weapons raises our risk rather than lowers it. We need a public that is willing to weigh in on this, that is willing to tell their elected officials what they think. In short, we need all of you. It's always an honor to talk to a TED audience. If there's a next time, I hope it's about progress we've made at thwarting this existential threat of our time, about the application of human ingenuity to solve complex problems, and not as a wake-up call because we have another crisis, a crisis potentially even more devastating than this one. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. That was wonderful and really thought-provoking. I think, your point that we are seemingly no better off than we were maybe, 50, 75 years ago is a point really well made, and one that we can explore further. Just a reminder to everyone who's in attendance, you may submit questions as you listen to these great talks. We are going to collect up some questions, and we may not be able to answer all of them individually, but we will be looking for common themes and use that to guide our conversation. Our next speaker is Sarah Bidgood, and she is the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. Her research focuses on U.S., Soviet, and U.S.-Russia nonproliferation cooperation, as well as the international nonproliferation regime more broadly. She is the co-editor of the book Once and Future Partners, the United States, Russia, and Nuclear Nonproliferation, which was published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in 2018. And she also leads the Young Women in Nonproliferation Initiative at CNS. So this is Sarah's first time joining us. at TEDxMidAtlantic, and I spotted some of her writing online on Twitter, actually, that was really, really insightful, and I felt like that she would be able to share some of those insights here with us in a live audience in a really dynamic way. So thank you for joining us, Sarah. Please welcome Sarah Bidgood.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking before a TED audience. So for the last month, like many of you, I've watched the conflict in Ukraine unfold with both heartbreak and sadness. And for the first time really in my professional life, I've also spent this time fielding questions from friends and family about the risks of nuclear war. I'm someone who focuses on US and Russian nuclear policy. So I do spend a lot of my time thinking about how and why the two largest nuclear weapon states could and should work together to reduce the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. In the last 5 weeks, as you can imagine, this work has become both more difficult and more urgent than ever before. So let me start by asking the question that I think is on many of our minds. What is the likelihood that nuclear weapons will actually be used in the course of the war in Ukraine? Now, there are different scenarios under which this could happen, some of which I think are potentially more realistic than others. But in general, I agree with many of my colleagues in the nuclear community that the risk remains low, but not zero. Now, it's worth remembering here at the outset that nuclear weapons are already being used in this conflict, just maybe not in the ways that you might be thinking. What I mean by this is that Russia is a nuclear armed state and NATO is a nuclear alliance, and the two sides are using their nuclear arsenals to deter one another as we speak. Since the Cold War, both sides have been held in check by an understanding that the first use of nuclear weapons would result in a devastating retaliatory strike. What that means is that the threat of nuclear weapons use is a part of our daily lives. It's just not one that seems to us to be very tangible or immediate. What I think has scared a lot of people I've heard from over the last month are the implicit and explicit nuclear threats that Putin and his senior officials have been using for compellence purposes in this conflict. On the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we heard Putin promise to bring consequences such as you have never seen in your entire history against anyone who would seek to stand in his way. On February 28th, he placed Russia's forces on what he called a special regime of combat duty, a confusing phrase that was not immediately clear to many of us looking in from the outside. Still, the message from the Kremlin to the West was hard to misinterpret. You'd better think twice before intervening against Moscow on Kiev's behalf. Now, some of my colleagues in the nuclear policy community believe that Putin's harsh rhetoric is just saber rattling. And I certainly hope that they're right. Since his threats are designed to keep the West out of Ukraine, so the argument goes, Putin would be unlikely to act on these so long as neither the United States nor NATO gets involved in this conflict directly. They support this view with what we in this field call Russian declaratory policy. Those are the documents that describe the circumstances under which Russia might use a nuclear weapon, and they spell out for other countries the red lines that they would need to cross in order to elicit a nuclear response. One of these documents is Russia's military doctrine. It tells us that the Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to their use against it or its allies, or in the case of conventional aggression that would threaten the very existence of the Russian state. Another one of these documents is a presidential decree from 2020 that describes Russia's principles of deterrence. It tells us that Moscow could use nuclear weapons in response to reliable information about a ballistic missile attack against Russia or its allies, or an attack against critical government infrastructure, including that which is associated with nuclear command and control. Now, listening to this, it's true that none of these scenarios sound quite like what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, and that might seem like encouraging news. In my view, though, I think we need to be careful not to extrapolate too much from these documents about the actual risk of nuclear use in this conflict. That's because Russian declaratory policy is about deterring an attack against Russia, against Russian territory. It's not about deterring interference from adversaries while Russia attacks a third country, which is the situation that we're facing in Ukraine. What I think can be more helpful is to look at the composition of Russian forces overall and what this tells us about how Moscow envisions using nuclear weapons in war. We can see from this that Russia's conventional capabilities have improved significantly over the last decade, but that it still relies heavily on nuclear weapons to manage the risk of escalation in a conflict. Russia's nuclear strategy suggests that it would use nuclear weapons only after it had run out of tools for conventional escalation and was unwilling to back down in the face of an existential threat. In contrast, what some scholars in the West have argued, it seems unlikely to me that Russia would automatically resort to using nuclear weapons to win a conventional war. Now, these insights are useful and encouraging, but they still leave us with a lot of unanswered questions. For me, these things are: what might Russia decide it needed to do if its conventional options had been exhausted? And when might Putin himself consider that an existential threat had been invoked, and particularly in the course of this conflict? It's very hard to find answers to these questions when we're looking from the outside in, but these questions are worth asking and they matter. That's because when people, whether policymakers or the general public, feel like they're faced with no good options, they become more likely and more willing to take big risks. As the situation becomes worse for Putin with the implementation of sanctions, increasing international isolation, and an unexpectedly difficult situation on the ground, his willingness to resort to nuclear use could rise. That makes for an incredibly delicate situation for policymakers in the West, who have to figure out how to enact punitive measures against Russia without simultaneously increasing the risk of escalation. For my part, when I've listened to Putin speak over the last 5 weeks, I've heard someone who believes that he can use nuclear threats to move up and down the escalation ladder in ways that suit his needs. From the standpoint of somebody who studies nuclear risk like myself, this is one part of this conflict that worries me a lot, especially at a time when Russia and Western forces are in close physical proximity as they are now. Ambiguous signals raise the risk of miscalculations and misinterpretations. That's the kind of situation where we could see the accidental use of nuclear weapons, even when that's not an outcome that either side would want. Now, fortunately, there are some mechanisms that are already in place, which are designed to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons would be used in scenarios like these. One of these is a direct communication link between the presidents of Russia and the United States. This so-called hotline was put in place in 1963 in the aftermath of probably the most significant nuclear close call in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. During 13 terrifying days in October of 1962, Kennedy and his advisors often found that communicating with Moscow through the diplomatic channels they had established was just too slow and clumsy. They needed ways of getting in touch right away with their Soviet counterparts to prevent things from getting out of hand. Now, some people have looked at this history and asked if Russia's war against Ukraine could help to convince policymakers that we need more tools to reduce the risk of nuclear use today. While it's possible that that will happen, and I certainly think that it should, I'm afraid that it's not going to be that easy. The historical record tells us that things are likely to get much worse for nuclear diplomacy before they're going to get better. This will be true even if this crisis shows policymakers and the public why it's more necessary than ever to engage with one another. I think that the highest barrier to overcome in this environment will be the anger and mistrust that now define the US and Russian relationship. This was certainly true of the post-Cuban Missile Crisis period, where similar emotions stood in the way of arms control negotiations for the better part of a year. In a similar environment, it's going to be hard for arms controllers on either side to show the kinds of flexibility necessary to reach an agreement today. It also makes it more likely that nuclear diplomacy will be held hostage to the crisis in US-Russian relations, even if actors on both sides can understand intellectually why avoiding an arms race is in their best interest. You may believe me, you may not, but you don't have to take my word for this. We're already seeing some of these impacts play out today. The US, for example, has suspended its strategic stability dialogue with Russia. And the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, has suggested that Moscow could withdraw from the only remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, the New START treaty, in response to US and European sanctions. Now, these developments aren't unexpected, but they come at a time when the future of arms control is precarious. The longer talks are paused, the more difficult, in my view, it will become, both from a political and bureaucratic standpoint, to return to the negotiating table. What's more, for some, this crisis will serve as a lesson about the importance of having a strong nuclear deterrent, and not necessarily about the risks of nuclear use that come with it. In this environment, there's no guarantee that the Senate would ratify a new US-Russia arms control agreement, even if the two sides were able to conclude one. The good news is that deliberate and persistent efforts on the parts of policymakers in both Washington and Moscow can go a long way towards overcoming these barriers. That was true 60 years ago, and it's still true today. In fact, the thing that ultimately broke the arms control and risk reduction stalemate between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis was President Kennedy's declaration of a unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing. That's what allowed the two sides to come back to the negotiating table, and that's what ushered in one of the most prodigious periods in bilateral arms control history. We don't have a sense for how this conflict will end, which makes it hard to say when or even if there will be political will for this kind of work on either side. In the meantime, it's going to be up to arms control supporters both inside and outside government to try to sustain enthusiasm for these efforts in the mid to long term. That's why, in my view, now more than ever, we need a next generation of nuclear experts with the creativity, the know-how, and the tenacity to take up this mantle. In an environment where almost nothing is certain, one of the few things we know for sure is that nuclear dangers aren't going away anytime soon. Thank you.
Wow, Sarah, thank you so much for that. That was, both kind of bewildering, comforting, and provided, I guess, some direction too at the same time. I think our listeners certainly will have some questions and ideas about how we move forward with that. I think the theme that I hear from both of you is that we really need to engage with this issue, and that's one of the things that led me to want to produce Emma's talk in 2019, but also this talk now, in that there is almost a reflexive action that a lot of people seem to have about this topic, where they just kind of want to shut it down because they don't want to think through what it means to engage with this issue. They don't want to consider the possibility that these weapons could be used. And obviously, we should, do everything we can to prevent that they ever should be used, because, if they are used, it's going to be a large-scale human tragedy, no matter almost what occurs. So we need to find ways to do that, but I don't know that we can do that without engaging with it. So on that note, we do have some questions starting to come in from our audience, and if you guys are just joining us, please go ahead and use the Q&A button to submit your questions. We'll be getting to those in a minute, but I wanted to kind of, start out with, I guess, the sort of moment that we're dealing with right now, where there's a lot of kind of speculation and worry that, Putin might decide to use some kind of novel, tactical nuclear weapon. You've got, the New York Times running stories about, the new, smaller, friendlier nukes of today that we don't have to worry as much about. I mean, it's like, there's almost like this sort of also, it's happening at the same time, this reevaluation of what all this means. And so, I saw yesterday an article that was with Masha Gessen. It was an interview with Masha Gessen being interviewed by Anand Giridharadas, and he was, talking with her about the idea that, okay, so suppose Putin decides to use a small tactical nuclear weapon against a Polish military base, because that Polish military base is being used to supply weaponry to Ukraine on behalf of NATO and the US. Would that be a valid target in his mindset? And then what do we do if he does that? And I wondered if maybe you could speak to, how that's being gamed out, what we should expect on that front, if that unthinkable reality were to come to pass. Either of you jump in on that.
Thanks, Dave. I'm really glad you raised this. I might start off on talking a little bit about tactical nuclear weapons, and then maybe pass to Sarah for some her thoughts on all of this playing out. It really is great that you brought this up, because I have seen in quite a few places, including the New York Times, this sort of discussion about tactical nuclear weapons as a sort of a small nuclear weapon, not such a big deal, something that could potentially be used on a battlefield. And I think, unfortunately, the idea of low yield or the tactical nuclear weapon is actually quite clever to marketing, really, because when you talk about the size of these nuclear weapons, a tactical nuclear weapon, low yield, could be 10 kilotons, right? That potentially the Russians could use somewhere. And the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons, right? And I think, we could be talking about a tactical nuclear weapon up to 100 kilotons. So the notion that this is somehow a smaller thing, not such a big deal, I think is really misplaced, and it's misleading to the public. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I think any nuclear use anywhere is really unacceptable. And that is something that we should be focusing on. What happens if someone uses any kind of nuclear weapon, break the sort of taboo that has lasted over 75 years? This is a really troubling kind of territory that we're entering. So just wanted to make that point about tactical nuclear weapons, and maybe Sarah would like to take the piece on the particular scenario.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. I think you laid out really clearly kind of why the line between tactical and strategic weapons is not as distinct as I think a lot of reporting has made it out to be, which is something that's really, really important. In some of the various scenarios, I think one of the big questions is what would actually happen if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon in the context of this conflict in Ukraine, whether that meant in Ukraine itself, or as you were describing, Dave, kind of against a NATO target. Obviously, the response to that would be, to those two scenarios, would be very different and very distinct, and it's hard to generalize about what that would look like across scenarios. But NATO itself has been quite kind of tight-lipped about what those responses would look like. I'm sure deliberately, because there is an advantage in some respects to strategic ambiguity. Not telling explicitly to your adversary what would happen if they crossed a red line can be a way of encouraging them to practice self-deterrence, and that can be beneficial to some extent. The considerations, though, that NATO officials would have to think through as they were deciding how to respond to something like this would be numerous, and they're not just related to deterrence. They relate to some of the things Emma was just talking about. How do we respond to a violation of the norm of non-use that has been in place for 75 years? I mean, that's something really significant. Were that line to be crossed, there would be a response to that. But how do you do that in a way that is non-escalatory or not escalating things further than they need to be escalated? I mean, those are the kinds of considerations that I'm sure will be in the minds of Western policymakers were it to come to this. And we just have to hope that it doesn't actually come to this and we're not faced with this situation.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. I was reading another article recently that it was an interview with it quoted an interview with Robert McNamara in the film The Fog of War, the Errol Morris documentary. And I guess Morris asked him, how did we get through all of these crises and the turbulent times of the 20th century? And McNamara's response was, we lucked out. And I'm afraid that we're on a similar trajectory right now where, there's a lot of potential danger and we may well luck out, and hopefully we do. But we need to recognize that that's a significant component of a successful outcome here. Now, on that front, I think one challenge with evaluating this situation is that we have to try to get into Putin's mindset. And, I think going into this conflict, a lot of people felt as though Putin was kind of a cold rationalist and was angling for advantage and trying to get concessions from the West and potentially, consolidate some gains in the Donbass and that kind of thing. As this has progressed, it's become a bit more clear that he's following this more Duginist, Eurasianist playbook, where he's really trying to sort of avenge not only the empire of the Soviet Union, but also the old Russian imperium, to restore that entire empire as it existed, during the times of Peter the Great and that kind of thing. So, it's, I think, difficult for Westerners sometimes to get into that mindset. And I've studied it just enough to understand how strange it is to Westerners, but I don't claim to be an expert on it by any means. But I think that it's challenging right now because we believe that there's all of these kinds of rules and statecraft and engagement and escalation ladders that will determine rational behavior in this. But when you've got somebody who's pursuing what he perceives as kind of mystic destiny for the country, and when you have his personality type, which we did a session on yesterday, talking about his psychology and how he resembles other kinds of narcissistic, malignant narcissist dictator types, like Adolf Hitler or Jim Jones or David Koresh. There's no telling where this might go. So I think a lot of people have put their faith kind of in the idea that if Putin gave an order to do something really insane, that there would be this layers of people beneath him that would say, nah, I don't think so. Maybe we're not going to do that. And while I don't hold out a lot of hope that Putin's going to be like deposed or taken out by his own people right now, that just doesn't seem in the cards. It does seem like that, there might be a way to insulate people from the worst outcomes by way of chain of command, let's say. So one of the questions that one of our listeners asked is how many Russians are in the chain of command to use nuclear weapons? And do we really know that? And is that really offering us much protection, or do we just not know? Either of you want to jump in?
Do you want me to take a stab?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes, because we had a little chat about this.
We did. Great. Yeah. So, for those who are interested in this question, Kristen van Broosgaard, who is a scholar in Oslo, has, I think, done tremendous analysis of what the kind of chain of command looks like in Russia. And so a lot of my insights are derived from her writing. But, what we understand to be the case is that unlike in the United States, where there are maybe 2 nuclear briefcases, in Russia, there are 3. And so Putin has one, the chief of the general staff has one, and the minister of defense also has one. And so what we understand to be the case is that 2 out of these 3 individuals would need to initiate the procedure for the launch of a nuclear weapon in order for that to happen. And presumably one of those 3 would need to be Putin. So I think, as is the case in the United States, it's a very centralized system. It's largely up to 1 to 2 individuals to make these decisions. A big question for me, you were kind of talking about the challenges of looking from the outside in and understanding what is happening inside Russian leadership right now. It's not apparent to me what information Putin is getting from his senior leadership and what they would say to him if he were to say, I'd like to introduce nuclear weapons into this conflict, or I think that we've now reached the point where we've exhausted our tools for conventional escalation and it's time to move into a nuclear phase. I don't know how they would respond to that, but that really determines in large part, at least based on my understanding of how the command and control system works, whether nuclear weapons would in fact be used. So a lot of, kind of unknowns there, but I think knowing that there are these 3 briefcases is helpful for our understanding of what that process looks like.
Sure, that at least gives us some idea what the structure is. Emma, do you want to speak to that at all?
I think the only thing that I'd add to Sarah's great summary is, think about what it's like in the United States for maybe people who don't know this, that the US president has the sole authority to launch a nuclear weapon. Now, I think, as you sort of alluded to in your setup remarks, Dave, there have been instances in the past where, when Nixon was purported to be drinking heavily and at the end of his presidency, and there were all kinds of other issues on his mind, Watergate scandal and all the rest, there was intervention that should he send a directive to launch a nuclear weapon, that whoever received that would need to consult with others in the administration. So, but that would have actually not been the setup according to the Constitution and how things should have been done. So, in a sense, you'd need to have maybe an act contrary to the Constitution in order to be able to prevent a president in the US who you were concerned about their mental state from launching a nuclear weapon. So there are some very thorny issues here, and it sort of gets us back to the issue of, 1 or 2 or a handful of people having this ultimate power to be able to launch a nuclear weapon and affecting the fate of billions around the world. So, I think there was, must have been another Nixon quote or it was attributed to Nixon, that he famously once said, I can go back into my office, pick up the phone, and 25 minutes later, maybe it was 70 million people will be dead. I can't remember the exact words right now.
Too many.
But far too many. And just the astounding, the scale of that is really astounding. So, I think it's just sort of bringing us back to the fundamentals here and how much we risk that we're kind of taking at the moment. And certainly it's why people are afraid.
Yeah, and to that point about interventions being made to sort of get in the way of maybe a presidential order, I believe that issue came up with President Trump last year. Right before the inauguration of Joe Biden, there was some kind of concern that one of the generals wasn't going to take orders from him if he did launch a nuclear strike and whatever. And in one sense, that's extremely honorable, but on the other hand, it's also unconstitutional. And I know a lot of military people that were like, I don't know how I feel about that. So I think, these are very thorny issues that we need to actually grapple with. So Joanne, one of our listeners, asks, is the UN treaty to prevent nuclear weapons signed by many non-nuclear powers totally irrelevant? You have any thoughts on that, or what, the role of multilateral treaties like that has in this situation?
Sure. No, it's not totally irrelevant. I think that the sort of coming together of people concerned around the world to express their concern is really relevant. And I know at the beginning stages, when there were movements to try to get the treaty, which grew out of this sort of humanitarian conference that looked at the implications of nuclear detonation or nuclear war or nuclear winter. I think, from those beginnings where there was a desire to create a treaty, a lot of people dismissed it and said, it'll never go anywhere. You won't get have countries to sign on. And, I believe we've got over 100 countries now. Actually, I should fact check that. I can't. that have signed up to the treaty, far more than a lot of people thought. And I think what it does is it allows for an expression of a different point of view. It also allows pressure to be put on countries that have nuclear weapons. And I think the reaction of some nuclear weapons countries to the fact that there is this treaty kind of shows that it matters. It's really a demonstration to try to hold them to account. Now, I know there are people in the sort of the world that we inhabit who think that the treaty, it's sort of damaging to the NPT, the cornerstone treaty of this area, to have an alternative treaty that maybe doesn't have the same kind of teeth or mechanisms to really hold countries to account. But I think really what it's doing is it's helping allow that expression and the discourse. And I don't think at all it's highly relevant. The treaty's entered into force. They're about to celebrate a year of the treaty. So, I'd be keen to hear what Sarah thinks too, based on her work sort of looking at the NPT. But I would say it's not totally irrelevant at all.
Yeah, I would second that, Emma. I mean, I also think, many things can exist at the same time that are serving similar ends. And so to my mind, the more efforts that are being put forward to reduce the risks posed by nuclear weapons, reduce the dangers posed by nuclear weapons, the better the community is going to be for that. But Emma, you did open the door for me to talk about the NPT, which is one of my favorite topics. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Joanne, I know that was not the question you were asking about. You were asking about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But we do have these multilateral mechanisms that have been in place for a long time that are designed to move us towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I think one of the things we're going to have to really think about carefully in the aftermath of this war in Ukraine is, what does this mean for proliferation? Not just what does this mean for the future of nuclear disarmament, which is what I talked about in my remarks, but what does this mean for countries who might be considering developing a nuclear capability? Are they going to be emboldened by what they see as Russia's actions in Ukraine, and the fact that Ukraine gave up or returned the nuclear weapons that had been on its territory at the end of the Soviet Union? How is that going to shape their thinking around the utility of nuclear weapons? And that's something we're going to have to watch carefully. I don't think we can have any kind of foregone conclusions about what this looks like, but I'm certain that in many countries where there is interest in developing a nuclear weapon, or has been talk about developing a nuclear weapon, there will be some folks who are emboldened by what they see happening in Ukraine. And whether or not that actually manifests in any material way, I don't know, but I do think that that can provide, unfortunately, really useful talking points for people for whom that is their parochial interest and who are interested in kind of promoting nuclear weapons as a tool for security. So that's something we're going to have to keep, a very close eye on, I think, in the nuclear community and within the public at large.
Got it. And Emma, you had an update on the number of test ban treaty countries.
Yes, and I think the the ban treaties, so not just the testing, but the actual possession of nuclear weapons. I think they'd love it that I said there were 100 states parties, because I've elevated the number, but there are actually 60 states parties, 86 signatories to the treaty. Where I got the 100 number from was that I know that there are over 100 organizations around the world, non-government organizations, who've been working to try to really activate countries on this issue. But it's 60 states parties and 86 signatories.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. So one question that has been floating around in the press and the media and whatnot, and I certainly have been hearing this in things like C-SPAN hearings and stuff like that, is the issue of hypersonic missiles, and the idea that these are really fast missiles that can show up sort of unannounced, and that we don't have a lot of great defenses for that. How significant of a development is that? Is that something that we should be additionally concerned about, or is this just kind of more saber rattling? And what's just the reality of defending against these kinds of missiles? Is this a real problem, or something that's just more talk?
Well, I think, hypersonic weapons aren't a game changer, really. None of Russia's nuclear weapons are a game changer. We've got all the weapons we need for that kind of contingency. It's important to know that ballistic missiles are hypersonic too. So I think there's been a lot of hype about this threat, but it's really not the kind of game changer that I think a lot of people are making it out.
Can you just briefly explain the difference between a ballistic missile and how it just generally works, and what a hypersonic missile does?
Oh, I might have to call on Sarah for that one, I think.
I mean, I think I can guess at it, but you guys are the experts.
I think one thing that's, I think the important thing to note here about hypersonic missiles when we're talking about them is that they're often maneuverable. And so that is different from a ballistic missile. When you have a ballistic trajectory come down, it's following a ballistic trajectory.
And it goes kind of up all the way into space and then comes back down.
Right. And then it comes down, and it comes down really fast. And that's where Emma's point about the fact that,
Sure,
hypersonic missiles and ballistic missiles are also hypersonic comes into play. Right. But I think for me, and this kind of gets to your, framing comments here, Dave, when you were asking your question, hypersonic weapons are often maneuverable, and that means that they can evade ballistic missile defenses. Now, we could have an entire separate TED talk about the efficacy of ballistic missile defense and whether we think that that's actually something that is particularly useful in practice. But at least the way that Russia has described its development of hypersonic weapons and these kind of new exotic systems that it's fielding, were as tools to evade US ballistic missile defenses. And so for me, the big takeaway when I look at, the new kinds of weapons that Russia is developing and what the United States is developing, is that you can get yourself very easily into an arms racing situation when you start to have, new technologies that disrupt the perceived strategic stability. And so, the more that, for me, hypersonic missiles are not a game changer, but they do represent this kind of step in the ladder towards arms racing that I think is something we need to pay close attention to. And we need to think about, how different weapons technologies kind of feed off one another and exacerbate perceived threats and things like that in ways that then stimulate arms racing in ways that are not, good for international security.
No, that makes sense. And I think to return to some of your comments from your talks, a lot of what's going on right now is behavioral modification by way of, using threats and concepts and images that, frighten the public, and that frighten lawmakers and frighten, politicians, presidents, So, invoking these kinds of new scary things like hypersonics is just another way of getting that kind of behavioral modification that you're hoping to get, which is, a way in which you quite rightly point out, nuclear weapons are already being used in this. It's just mostly being used for behavioral modification. So Ben here asks, do you think the use by Russia of biological or chemical weapons would bring one or more NATO countries into the conflict and increase the risk that Russia would climb the escalation ladder to nuclear? I don't know if you have particular expertise on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you feel like you can answer it.
I'm happy to take a stab here, and I'll caveat this by saying that I don't work particularly on chem bio issues. So I'm reading the same things everybody else is and kind of trying to read the tea leaves. But I mean, NATO officials have been very clear, and so has President Biden, that the use of chemical weapons in particular in this conflict would be what they've referred to as a game changer. Now, they haven't elaborated how that would change the game and exactly what that would look like, but it's clear that that would also be a significant crossing of a red line. I'm not sure, in response to Ben's comment, whether it's tough to say sort of where chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons fit in as rungs on an escalation ladder. I'm not sure I would quite describe it in that way. I think those are different entities. So I don't think it's a certainty, for example, that if Putin were to resort to the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, that the next step up from that would be nuclear weapons use. I'm not sure that we can really say that, but it would certainly represent an erosion of the non-use of weapons of mass destruction in general. And I think that could create an environment where there is a pretext for further escalation that could mean nuclear use. And that's really scary. So, part of what we need to be thinking about here in the context of this conflict is how to preserve the norm of the non-use of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and why it's important to do that, not just in the context of this conflict, but for the normative environment in the long run in the international security space.
Makes sense. Emma, you want to add to that?
Yeah, if I could add something to that. I mean, I think, in response to Ben's question, it's important to recognize that when he asks, would chemical or biological weapons bring NATO countries into the conflict, I think it's important to recognize all of the activities and the actions that NATO countries and the US are taking in this conflict. Not, boots on the ground, but the kinds of sanctions that they're imposing on Russia to try to squeeze Putin in really an unprecedented way than we've seen before, and also, the humanitarian aid and the taking in of refugees in a significant way. So I think sometimes it can be tempting to think about trying to solve a conflict through military engagement, conventional forces, but there is a lot that can be done and that is being done to try to address the situation short of that. I know that wasn't the point of Ben's question, but I just wanted to make it clear that it's not that we're able to do nothing here. It's just that the nuclear threat does constrain the range of options that we're able to take. I think one thing that I do want to say too is that Putin has used the chemical weapons fairly recently. So I think the thing is that the norm maybe has been broken a little bit by Putin himself. And what I worry about is that could potentially embolden him in a way to use them in this conflict in a way that he might not have previously, because when he's used these chemical weapons, there seemed to be a red line, and then there was no particular penalty for him in that respect. So that's what really concerns me here. I think, and maybe I shouldn't be speculating, but potentially chemical is more likely than actually a detonation of a nuclear weapon at this point.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that we need to think about is, let's turn around and think about this from Putin's perspective once again, where, what he fundamentally believes, rightly or wrongly, is that, NATO is illegitimate, NATO is hypocritical, NATO is, not competent and isn't going to stand up for its Article 5 obligations. And he believes that for a variety of reasons, many of which are based on stories that he's told himself about how he ended up in his current situation and what the situation with Ukraine is. I think that he feels as though part of his thesis with this war is to prove his theories about what NATO is actually all about. So I think that there exists at least some motivation to continue to escalate things up to a point where NATO is proven to be hypocritical. That seems to have been where this has kind of been going, and I believe that he may continue on that path unless he is either prevented from doing so by realities on the ground or otherwise distracted. And that was something else that Masha Gessen was saying yesterday, is he's just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And at what point does the outcry from the populations of Western countries become so great that the government feels as though it has a moral obligation to respond or be shown to be hypocritical in some way? So I feel like that's kind of the path that we're on, unfortunately, and that may not end very well. Now, my friend Kat, who is a very dedicated environmental activist, as well as an anti-nuclear weapons activist, has asked a couple of questions, one of which is, how might 1.2 million Rotarians taking a stand for a nuclear-free world, what impact might that have on nuclear negotiations? And I would expand that to be not just Rotarians. I mean, what can groups, what can organizing networks of people do to really make an impact on this situation? And are there examples or organizations that you think are doing a particularly good job of driving that conversation?
Emma, want to take a stab?
Sure. I think there are two issues here, right? One is, what can people do right in this immediate time? And that's separate to what can people do in terms of taking a stand about this issue in the longer term. I mean, I think one thing that is really important for people to do is to get educated and to understand the topics and what's at stake, so that they can have an informed opinion and then pressure their policymakers who are making those decisions about what needs to happen. So I certainly think anytime you can get 1 million people together or more people together to really push and demand answers and demand better policies that keep us safer, it's absolutely very important. And I think it's particularly important now because I don't get the sense that there are people who are determining nuclear posture and policy deep inside government that think that the public cares or that they need to respond to public demands in a way. And I think part of this issue is that it's been long forgotten for decades. It's been around 40 years or so since we had the march of 1 million people then in Central Park. I do think that people expressing their views does make a difference. And I think it's particularly important to do now, given that it's such a dangerous time. It's hard to say what you can do right now, other than obviously support the humanitarian disaster and the groups that are doing terrific work there, support the people who are having to flee Russia and Ukraine, because we're seeing it out of Russia as well. But then sort of think about who they can support and how they can get involved on this larger awareness raising about nuclear weapons and better nuclear policy. There is one other of Kat's questions that I'd love to answer, but what I'll do is I'll throw to Sarah to see if she's got any further responses on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And it's a great question, Kat. I mean, I think, so I talked a little bit in the end of my comments about the importance of kind of engaging a next generation of nuclear experts. We are at a moment in our field when many folks are retiring. So many people who have worked in the kind of nuclear space for a long time may be heading towards retirement. And this could precipitate a really significant personnel crisis in our field. I think regardless of how you feel about nuclear weapons, and I think if you are interested in seeing a nuclear weapons free world, this is still the case. We want nuclear weapons to be safe and secure in the period of time when they exist. And that means that we need people who kind of work in the nuclear enterprise, who know what they're doing, to be able to make sure that that's the case. But we need a next generation who can kind of take up that mantle. That's not going to happen automatically. And to Emma's point, if there is kind of a lack of interest among the general public, among students, a lack of awareness about careers in this field, issues that they might be able to apply their own skills and interests to solving, that's problematic for us. So I believe, really strongly in my own work. Dave, you had mentioned in my intro that I lead a young women's initiative to engage more undergraduate women in this field. I mean, that's the kind of thing I think we need to be doing early, help people think through why it's important to address nuclear challenges, how they can bring their talents to this field and make sure that this is a welcoming field that everybody feels like they have a voice. So I think that kind of piggybacks on what I think Kat was getting at. And Dave, to your point as well, it's not just Rotarians, it's all of us in society thinking through how we can more actively engage. So
exactly. And just one follow-up on that point, you clearly have been working with young women and students and whatnot on this topic. Is there advice that you might give to young women, say in high school or college, who are interested in this field and trying to create a safer world in terms of things they might want to study or, programs they might want to explore, that kind of thing?
Oh, Dave, your check is in the mail. I'm so glad you asked that question, because that is one of my favorite things to talk about. I do talk to a lot of undergraduate women about this, and I think I have a couple of different pieces of advice. I mean, one is, we know at the undergraduate level, it can be very difficult for students to study these issues in depth. There aren't a lot of classes that deal with nuclear issues. Educate yourselves. There are terrific resources online, particularly, as a result of this age of COVID. A lot of things and events and courses that were previously only accessible, maybe if you were living in DC, are now accessible through the internet. So that's a fantastic resource that we now have. I think also developing your voice as a person who can talk in an authoritative way about nuclear weapons is something you can do at the undergraduate level. Pick a topic dealing with nonproliferation or arms control for a term paper. Start figuring out your own thoughts about these issues and figuring out how you're going to write about them and communicate them. And last but not least, I would say start to kind of do different types of writing. So a lot of the work that we end up doing in our field is not academic writing, it's op-ed writing, it's communicating with policymakers and the general public. You can develop that tone, that style of writing as an undergraduate by writing for your college paper, your hometown newspaper, what have you. I think that's, communication is key here. And once you've kind of started to master the issues, thinking about how you're going to tell other people about them is a really important skill to have.
I couldn't agree more. And certainly, we in the TED community feel really strongly that one of the roles that, we have in that process is science communication, policy communication, trying to figure out how to tell engaging stories that communicate important topics to a broad audience. So that's a point where very well made. Now, Emma, you wanted to return back to Kat's other question?
I did, but I'll just make a quick follow-up to that. I agree with absolutely everything that Sarah has said. I would add, find internships, find people in the field, network, and also don't be afraid to ask people to mentor you. I think particularly amongst certain groups, I know I've certainly benefited from mentors in the past. So, if you benefit from that, you're keen to pass it on. So I think I would just sort of say, for people who are interested, really, try to break in, do what you can. And the good news is that while there are a lot of people approaching retirement age, while there's not a lot of funding in this field for this work, I'm seeing some really terrific younger people from a range of backgrounds, lived experiences, perspectives, and even older people as well, really want to engage on this topic now. So I think, the future can be bright, and we really need all of the brain power, as I said in my remarks. But if I can return to Kat's question here, and it was, how might we include our unintended consequences in the cost of nuclear weapons? I mean, it's such an interesting question. When you think about what nuclear weapons enable, and then the cost of those downstream ripple effect issues like the humanitarian crisis and all the rest that I mentioned. That would be a very difficult study, I think, but quite an interesting kind of mental exercise. It just kind of reminds me, I think it's important for people to know just how much money goes to nuclear weapons. And, projections of modernization in the United States of, upwards of $1 trillion over the next several decades. And when you start to think about how some of that money could be better used to face climate change, pandemics, one now and future pandemics, education, healthcare, student loans are a big one. Are we really putting our resources where they matter most and in the priority that they matter? So I think this is really important for us to be thinking about where are we putting our money, and what are the consequences of not funding some of these other issues while we're continuing to feed nuclear weapons at such an enormous amount of cost.
Yeah, and Kat had a sort of a follow-on question to that about the intersectional impact on climate. But I think, you make the point there that every minute that we're spending paying attention to nuclear weapons and thinking about, building them or taking them apart or doing whatever with them is time we're not spending focusing on climate. And I might, there's quibbles that you could make about whether or not the money that you spend on one is, a zero sum with the other. But at the same time, like, I think it's about attention. It's like, if we're just spending all of our time worried about this, we're not worried about these other things that we need to deal with. So really good point. Claire has a question, which I thought was kind of interesting. Can we have your thoughts on how nuclear is re-entering the public awareness? It wasn't rare before to hear references to the bomb in popular music and movies. And films, but it's faded into fiction more and sort of something of the past at this point, and less part of our real world concerns on a day-to-day basis. Do you believe that we will see a whole generation objection to this increase of awareness? And how are we going to deal with this culturally, I suppose, is the broader question.
I think we are seeing more of a renaissance in nuclear art. And I think there's more coming pretty soon. I think it did obviously fade out of consciousness and therefore in popular culture. Part of what I worry about now is some of the movies that you see and some of the depiction of nuclear weapons in pop culture now are about it saving the day or, defeating an asteroid that's coming in to hit the Earth. And in that way, the kind of the gravity of the weapons and what they can do aren't really properly portrayed. But as I was saying earlier, the kind of new thinking and new people I'm seeing coming into the field include artists. And there's been some really remarkable work done, fairly recently, a multimedia experience called The Bomb that premiered in Tribeca in 2016 was really remarkable. They have a museum installation version circulating now, and other kinds of, command and control, Eric Schloss's book that then was made into a documentary. And the list goes on though, and there are more recent things now. So I think we'll see it. And I think that's just such a good way of getting people to feel something about nuclear weapons and connect with them in a way that just the abstract talking, reading the papers doesn't. So, Kat, no, it was Claire, wasn't it? I think it's coming, so watch this space.
Gotcha. Sarah, would you like to add to that?
I think Emma summed it up perfectly. I mean, it's also my impression that as part of kind of diversifying our field, which is something we urgently need to do, part of that is bringing in people from different disciplines to help us understand the challenges posed by nuclear weapons and disarmament and all kinds of things like that. I mean, in addition to artists who I agree play a fundamental role in helping the public connect with some of these issues that we're talking about, I also see a lot of great work being done by anthropologists and sociologists who are really thinking through, what do these mean? What do these weapons mean for us as a society? How do we kind of talk about them and understand them in whole of society context? And so there are some important insights to be derived there. And I hope that we can continue to make this an inclusive space where folks who are approaching these issues from very different perspectives from a traditional, political science or IR background are able to bring their valuable contributions to bear.
One of the things that's kind of concerned me in my study of disinformation and information warfare relative to this current conflict is that there's a certain amount of, I would say, neo-reactionary, heterodox kind of philosophy that's starting to develop in certain corners of the internet around the idea that, what really matters is the long-term survival of the human race. So, becoming a multiplanetary species, it doesn't really matter so much with climate because, whatever, as long as we make it to Mars, we'll be okay. And, in 10,000 years or whatever, it'll all come out in the wash. There's a philosophy promoted by a guy named Nick Bostrom called long-termism, which, incorporates many of these ideas. And one of the dangerous ideas that I think has been kind of filtering through culture, let's say over the last 20 years or so, starting maybe with movies like Clear and Present Danger, that depict, the use of a nuclear weapon in the United States is that, if it's small enough, it's no big deal, you can survive it. There's, I think, among certain circles, an idea that some kinds of nuclear exchange might be survivable. I think that the reality of that is quite different. And I think that people are not, while on the one hand, you might not immediately get, flashed away in a big blast, the consequences of living with that kind of deployment, radiation sickness and cancer and everything else is so real. And I was curious about your thoughts, either of you, about, the depiction of how survivable any kind of nuclear, deployment actually is in culture, and whether we ought to be taking more steps to alter some of these, let's say, flirtatious perceptions that, maybe this stuff is really okay.
Well, I have to say, I mean, during the pandemic, like many people, I spent quite a bit of time watching movies. And I did go through and try to sort of watch all of the nuclear movies that have, come out in, I would say, the last, 30 or 40 years. And one that I had not seen, but I know so many people talk about having impacted their lives, was Threads, which was this movie that aired on, I believe, on the BBC. So it was played for a national British audience. And it does depict in just, I can't even describe the starkest possible terms, what would happen if there were to be, a nuclear war. And it is horrifying. And, my understanding is that, that was shown on national television, same with The Day After, which was also shown on national television in the 1980s. I don't think that there's been anything that's quite been the equivalent of that, but it is, important to have these big national conversations that are sparked by depictions of nuclear destruction, in my view, with a larger audience, with a bigger group. And sometimes movies can reach those kinds of audiences. I do think we need to walk a careful line between scaring people so much that they feel paralyzed by that fear and feel like they can't possibly do anything about this and that nuclear war is inevitable, because that's not productive either. We want people to feel as though they can have an impact on changing the trajectory of, nuclear proliferation, whether it's vertical or horizontal. So there is a fine line to be walked there, I think, in the public conversation around nuclear weapons. And it'll be interesting to see how some of these artists who Emma mentioned coming into the space are going to inform that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have anything to add on that, Emma?
Completely agree with what Sarah said. I think in looking at, say, a small detonation between India and Pakistan, there are studies that sort of show what the impact of that would be globally, and it's not pretty. So I think for people to think that that's something far away over there that's not going to impact them is really misguided. I think, we've all been living through a global pandemic where we've seen disruption to supply chain and the effects on a whole range of ability for food and medicine and all the rest. And I think if we had some kind of detonation, we'd be seeing that kind of on steroids. So, I really think that people need to think about this more seriously, but that also more work needs to be done to think, what would the consequences be? Because I don't know that we've fully thought through what would the day after look like, from not just the sort of the blast, the radiation and the immediate death, but what does that then look like, the ripple effects down the line? Because I think it's going to be much more intense than people might have realized.
Yeah, and I think there's also kind of, in internet culture, there's a certain amount of trust in technological determinism and some idea that, if there was some kind of catastrophe, that technology would help us overcome it. Well, yeah, okay. Let's be real about that. How able will we be to deploy and distribute technology in a post-nuclear exchange kind of world? I just think it's completely, fantastical to think that. And, I think the other thing we need to think about is if they were to use some kind of a, let's say, a 10 kiloton device in Poland, well, which way does the wind blow? It goes into Belarus, it goes into Russia, So, let's just kind of come on here. This is kind of ridiculous scenarios in a lot of ways. And, I think there's also been a lot of anxiety around, the various activity at the various nuclear sites in Ukraine, Chernobyl and Zaporizhia. I think those are all of serious concern, but I also think a lot of that was kind of, exaggerated relative to the actual science of those situations. Also plays into this idea of behavior control by way of wielding fear that worked into Putin's hands pretty effectively. Certainly, I know, I knew people that were very, very afraid of what was going on at Zaporizhia, back in early March. And, obviously it was terrifying, like who knows where that might go. It's the largest nuclear plant in Europe. So let's see here. So we have a few more questions that we can go through. We have one viewer asking, in your view, how prepared is NATO in terms of, quote, interoperability to engage in a conventional / nuclear war with Russia? And I suppose that means, being able to deploy different assets to different NATO countries. Is that something either of you are able to speak to?
Well, I don't feel necessarily like I'm equipped to speak to that, but I will just say, I mean, I think in some respect, although I understand where the question's coming from, I think that that's putting the cart before the horse. I think that the focus for us needs to remain on how to prevent this war from getting to a point where there would be an escalation to nuclear use. I don't think we're quite at a stage yet where we need to be thinking through what exactly would NATO do were this to happen. I know that's been a little bit of a part of our conversation, but my focus is certainly going to remain on trying to inform a public discussion that is more about how to prevent escalation from happening. So hopefully we don't have to answer that exact question that's been posed.
Yeah, fair enough. Emma, anything else to add on that?
Completely agree. Yeah.
Okay, so Al asks, how many nations have or are within 5 years of developing nuclear weapons? So what other countries are coming online, do we think?
Well, I think that the country that people are worried most about now is Iran. And we had the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama signed back in 2015, that a few years later, President Trump just withdrew from, imposed maximum pressure and sanctions on Iran, hoping that they would come back to the table to negotiate a better deal in his view, in the interest of the United States. Unfortunately, what we've seen in that time is that after withdrawal, Iran complied with the deal for around a year and then started building up its nuclear capabilities on the technical side. And we're at a point now where the US is trying to negotiate with the Iranians for both of them to come back into compliance on the deal. And Iran has been able to develop and produce enough material that it could be within a couple of weeks or so of enough material for a nuclear bomb. Now, that's not to say that in a few weeks, if it kept going, it would be able to produce a bomb that it could deploy somewhere. That would take longer to actually take that material, weaponize it into a bomb, and then mate it with a delivery system, potentially up to 2 years. So I don't want to be alarmist here, but this is why it's so critical now that the US and Iran come back into the deal, comply, because, I think that would be able to set back, there could be agreements negotiated, which is what they're trying to do now, to set back Iran's program further away from having enough material for a bomb, potentially to 6 months or so. That allows for more time and inspections of Iran's program to know whether Iran makes the decision at some point to actually get a bomb. So as far as we all know now with intelligence, it doesn't look like Iran's made a decision to create the bomb. It is just producing the material that if it continues, it might. So this is the really critical one, right? So that's why we need to get back to a deal. We need to set back Iran's program that gives us enough time to react in a different way if Iran tries to actually create a weapon. So that's the country I worry about the most. Do I think in the next kind of 5 years, I think that's how he asked it, that we'll see additional nuclear weapons countries? I don't think so. I think others are, if they had intention, are a reasonable ways away. Some countries do have enough material that they could fashion into bombs relatively easily, like Japan, but I don't see any decision by Japan to actually create a bomb. So I think if we can get back to the deal, in 5 years, we won't have any additional nuclear weapon states. But I would love to hear Sarah's analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I agree with that. I mean, Iran is, of course, the one that comes to my mind, and that's been the topic of conversation for several years now. I want to amplify something that you said at the end of your remarks, Emma, which I think is really critical, which is that, we've been talking sort of about technological determinism a little bit here. The same applies to nuclear weapons. So there are countries that could have the technological capability to pursue a nuclear capability. Does that mean that they're going to do it? No, there are lots of factors that influence whether countries decide they want to try to pursue, a latent nuclear capability or an actual nuclear capability. And some of them are pretty hard to see from the outside. They have to do with, kind of bureaucratic interests or domestic political interests or prestige considerations, things like that. So I don't think we need to, nuclear prognostication is a fool's errand. So I want to be very careful not to do too much of that. But I do think we don't need to be losing sleep over the idea that within 5 years we could see, 15 nuclear weapons countries or something like that come online. I think there are a lot of constraining factors beyond just how could nuclear weapons help my security as an individual state that play into those decisions. And I think that should hearten us a little bit.
That makes sense. Now, I did want to return to one topic that Emma brought up in her initial remarks about the last time this, topic came up at scale was, I think, in 2017 with North Korea. They've been testing new ICBMs and doing all sorts of saber rattling themselves. My personal opinion as a sort of amateur analyst is that, they are acting in many ways as a Russian client state and are representing some of Putin's interest in creating fear, especially in the Japan region. But just in terms of anything to keep an eye on with North Korea, do you guys have any, fresh insights as to, what North Korea thinks it's doing, what kind of threat that represents, and what we might look for in terms of, next steps with North Korea?
Well, I think, North Korea, I think, has a habit of, when there's not a lot of attention on North Korea, attention is elsewhere, doing something like a missile test or something like that. I think we do need to be taking it seriously and watching developments and thinking about what the right response is and how to engage North Korea diplomatically to try to make sure that we don't see developments of the kinds that we don't want. I think potentially one thing to look for is whether they test a nuclear weapon again next, which potentially could come after this last test. But I just think we need to make sure we're not taking our eyes off the ball on North Korea while we're focused elsewhere.
No, that makes sense. Anything else to add on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that one of the challenges right now is that the UN Security Council is having a lot of trouble taking unanimous decisions because of this war that Russia has launched against Ukraine. And so I do think, I do wonder what would happen if North Korea were to, for example, test a nuclear weapon. Would it be possible for the UN Security Council to come up with kind of unanimous condemnation of that at this particular moment? Or is that going to be impossible and a bridge too far because of these bigger rifts in the relationship between Russia and the West and Russia and the United States? So, I'm not a North Korea expert, but I can imagine how, if I were, North Korean or a North Korean decision maker, I might be thinking this could be an opportune moment while the rest of the world is distracted, as Emma was saying. And I think there are some very real kind of challenges for multilateralism in responding to North Korean provocations right now that could make this an opportune moment for some bad behavior from Pyongyang.
Yeah, it makes sense. So we are almost out of time. What I'd like to do to wrap up, if you don't mind, is I have a question I'd like to just ask each of you, which is, what is your idea of a best case resolution of this scenario? And how do we deal with these kinds of threats going forward? This, as short as you can make that answer. Either of you.
Sarah, do you want to go first? Oh, okay, all right, I'll go first. It's that dance, isn't it? So I think we really need a ceasefire and a diplomatic settlement to end the war. So there are some key things to resolve here, which is Ukraine's neutrality and who controls Donbas region. We have to think about how this ends for Putin and what are the ramifications. As I said in my opening remarks, do we hold him accountable for what he's done? And how do we make sure that we prevent Putin from taking this kind of action in the future of sort of holding nations hostage? So I think we need to make sure that we're sending a clear message that his threats are absolutely unacceptable. But then longer term, we need to be trying to solve this issue, as I mentioned as well, working with people from cross disciplines to make sure that we don't keep reacting to these crises, but that we're thinking about where do we want to be in 10, 20, 30 years and trying to figure out how we get from here to there. So that's my kind of, summation of what we need now on Ukraine and where we need to be going in the future.
Great, that was excellent. Sarah, you want to provide insights?
Yeah, I think I'll stay focused on the nuclear issue here in particular, which is the topic with which we began our conversation. I mean, for me, what I hope is that, obviously, it's going to be very hard to make progress on arms control or non-proliferation issues at a time when there's a devastating war going on. Understandably, people are so focused on thinking about stopping the killing that it's really hard to think about what the next step is. But my hope is that we can do two things at once. I think we're capable of that. I think we can both be looking for ways to end this conflict, but also not losing sight of these bigger, longer term issues that Emma just referenced. So my hope is that we can find some way to continue to do the important work of reducing the risk of nuclear war, of, ridding the world of the nuclear threat, and simultaneously figuring out a way to address this incredibly tragic and pressing problem that we're facing right now.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you both for joining us today. This has been incredibly informative, and I'm so looking forward to sharing this online and getting this available for others to be able to watch over the coming weeks and months. So again, thank you to Emma and to Sarah. We are going to be hosting more of these events going forward, probably be back in about 2 weeks with some additional content as part of this series. I also want to make an ask of everyone listening, which is to donate to World Central Kitchen. World Central Kitchen is the nonprofit operated by Chef Jose Andres, which is currently feeding people all throughout Ukraine and also in the region there. The CEO of World Central Kitchen is my friend Nate Mook, who is actually my business partner with TEDxMidAtlantic. And he is there putting his life on the line to feed refugees and people that are being forced out of their homes. So you can do that at wck.org/donate. You can also contribute to TEDxMidAtlantic if you'd like to support our work on this kind of programming. You can do that at TEDxMidAtlantic.com/donate. And we will be posting this online probably tomorrow, but if not by tomorrow, Saturday or so. And really appreciate all of you joining us today for this important conversation. And we will see you next time. And thanks again to Emma and Sarah.